It was really fun to have Chris Seiple from Wood Mackenzie on for our very first Zoom podcast recording today. He is a longtime partner of SIA in developing our quarterly solar market insight report. And he came to us today with a lot of terrific insights on what the solar and storage market is doing here in the US. And the headline for me is the market's going to drive outcomes no matter who's president of the United States. So I felt like this is a terrific opportunity for our listeners to hear from the source of our data and research to hear about what's going on with the market in the U.S.
Yeah, totally agree. It's so valuable to have analysts and partners like Wood Mackenzie who really see the whole field and understand the entire sort of energy system and the space in which we operate, because that's the conversation that I think policymakers want to have, right? They don't want to think about, solar in a vacuum. They want to understand the entire landscape of how we are sort of producing and generating and then consuming electricity in this country. And Chris does a phenomenal job of sort of articulating, the different sort of interconnected ways in which we have to look at all of this. And he really underscores how we're in a different environment when it comes to energy demand. And over the next 5 years, if we don't really maximize our use of solar and storage and other, quickly deployable clean energy technologies, we're just not going to be able to meet the kinds of economic growth and energy growth and AI growth that I think everybody wants to see. And so it's, it just really ties in all of those angles around global competitiveness and manufacturing and, a lot of, general economic goals that I think we have in this country, and how all of it kind of comes back to growing the solar industry. So it's really nice to be able to kind of put that whole context around it. And it's great to have Chris to lay that out in a very academic way.
100%. Our listeners should definitely tune into this one to get a sense of why speed to deployment in energy matters so much right now. There's only one way to do it fast, and that is through solar and storage. If we don't take a data-driven approach and a fact-based approach to how we work together to stay competitive, deploy enough energy to stand up these facilities in states across the U.S., we're going to lose. So he was able to dig into the why with us today, and I think that's a really it's now's the time to do that. So we appreciate having him here.
So Chris, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate you taking some time to walk us through the latest trends here. We've SIA and Wood Mackenzie have been partnering for a long time on a variety of sort of research efforts, including sort of the flagship Solar Market Insight Report, the latest of which came out last week. So really appreciate you taking some time to dig into it with us. Wanted to just start by, asking you to sort of reflect on 2024 and maybe any surprises or things that struck you as particularly noteworthy. I think we're sort of accustomed at this point to hitting records and surpassing them in the solar and storage industry. So that might not be much of a shock at this point, but any kind of initial takeaways that struck you from 2024 from a solar and storage growth perspective.
Yeah, Colin, thank you very much for having me on the podcast today. Very much appreciate our partnership with SIA. And I think that was interesting. We're used to accomplishing this, all of these records every year. It's maybe not a surprise, the records that we've experienced, but I do think we should just start out this morning with a celebration, because it's pretty remarkable. Like it is really, really remarkable when you sit back and you look at it. Like the Inflation Reduction Act passed in 2022. That's only 2 years ago. It's an incredibly complicated piece of legislation. And so when you think about what developers have done to develop thousands of projects around the country, the work federal employees have done to put all of these rules into, all of the legislation into actual rules that we can all use, the bankers and the lawyers that have had to help navigate this, have had to raise new sources of tax capacity to bring to the market, and, a manufacturing sector that's scaled up, like that's remarkable. And we have gone from a doubling of capacity from where we are where we were in 2022, 50 gigawatts of additions this year. And that is a direct result of the Inflation Reduction Act. So 2024 was really the year of kind of seeing the full impact of what the Inflation Reduction Act could do, and it was really remarkable. I think on the one thing that is a little bit of a surprise to me is I'm pretty impressed and amazed with how quickly the solar manufacturing industry has been able to ramp up. I don't think we anticipated that it would move this fast. And, we have gone from 7 gigawatts of module manufacturing capacity in the US pre-Inflation Reduction Act to 40 gigawatts of manufacturing capacity today, and that's a really remarkable achievement to me, which is actually a little bit surprising. And we still have more manufacturing capacity coming online. Like we're not done yet. So that renaissance is pretty impressive.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more.
I love that, Chris. I wondered if we could make it real for folks, right? That 50 gigawatts, who knows what a gigawatt is? But new solar capacity in 2024, the most capacity added by a single energy source in over 2 decades. And I wondered if you could talk for a second about why that matters. This is the first time in history that domestically produced supply can actually meet demand. And to your point about the Inflation Reduction Act working as a piece of legislation to drive a renaissance of the manufacturing industry, tell us a little bit more about what that actually means.
Yeah, I guess, to put it in a little bit more concrete terms, so solar and storage was roughly, I think, about 85% of all capacity that was added in the United States. So it is the main thing that we're, adding to the grid right now.
To put that into context, that's enough power to supply 7 million homes in the United States. That's a lot of capacity. We've not added capacity at that scale in a very long time.
And, the manufacturing renaissance, like outside of one company, manufacturing of solar had largely disappeared from the United States. And we are completely dependent on, a set of companies that come from a country that we're not particularly comfortable relying on as a long-term partner. Mm-hmm. And so it is remarkable that we've kind of also been able to help accomplish the national security goal in reducing our dependence on, somebody that we don't necessarily consider a reliable partner long-term.
Yeah, 100%. Last week we were at Sarah Week in Houston, which, obviously we heard from a lot of the members of the administration. We heard from a lot of the big oil and gas CEOs. There was tons of renewable energy folks there as well, academics, and over and over and over again, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, AI, domestic manufacturing, crypto. The conversation was very, very repetitive. And it was a wonderful opportunity for us to talk about speed to deployment. The solar and storage industry is growing so quickly. Obviously, if you want to achieve American energy dominance and you want to not sort of cede global market share to the one country, as you pointed out, that we don't want to cede market share to, you have to make sure that the all of the above energy strategy includes solar and storage. And so what do you think is going to happen next? What do you looking into the crystal ball, what does that forecast look like?
Yeah, there's a lot of uncertainty right now, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit, the uncertainty that the industry faces. But when you look at the development pipelines, what people have been working on for really like almost a decade now, the types of projects that are being developed, the queue of projects that sit in the queues around independent system operators across the country are largely dominated by, they are dominated almost entirely by renewable energy. I actually looked up a stat. I think in 2021, only 3% of projects in the queue were gas-fired projects, to provide some perspective on that. And so we have an industry that has been building this capacity for a number of years that is sitting there with the projects that are most shovel ready, and the projects that can be brought online, most quickly. And so, we don't see any reason that this kind of, the amount of additions that we've had in 2025 won't continue into the future. And it's really, the bottleneck for the industry is not the amount of projects that are available to be added to the grid. It's not the amount of solar equipment anymore. That used to be a problem, but now we have this manufacturing sector, and we have other supply chain sources, that are not necessarily China dependent, and so the bottlenecks really are other constraints in the supply chain, like getting transformers, but even transformers, it's solar companies that have ordered the transformers that exist. So it's the renewable energy projects that have actually added the transformers and can add the capacity. And then the other thing is just scaling the amount of transmission capacity that's available to accommodate this level of renewables. Those are the bottlenecks now. It's not the availability of projects that can move forward.
You referenced some of the uncertainty that we're facing here in 2025. And one of the things that I think has been really helpful that your team has started doing over the last few years is building in some of that uncertainty into the forecast and presenting sort of a low, a mid, and a high case for what we might see going forward. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about what some of those levers are that make the difference between those scenarios, and kind of how we're prognosticating in terms of near term and midterm deployment.
Yeah. So Colin, we can go faster than what we're doing right now. And in fact, the United States needs us to go faster, right? Like as an industry, for reasons that you just alluded to recently that you were talking about at Sierra Week. And so there are certain things that are outside of our control that might help move faster. For instance, if we had a reduction in interest rates, that in particular would help distributed solar, which is sensitive to what interest rates are. But the things that we the things that collectively we have more control over are things like the pace of transmission expansion. And this is maybe a little noticed thing that happened in 2000 in this past year that I'm really encouraged by. Just two examples I want to point out. Well, the one is, we've always had technologies available, grid enhancing technologies that could enable us to get more capacity out of the existing system, but electric utilities have been relatively slow to adopt those technologies. But now that utilities are struggling to connect demand to the grid fast enough, we now have 3 utilities, Georgia Power, Dominion, and Nevada Power, all utilities that have substantial load being added to their system, who are actually deploying at a large scale grid enhancing technologies. And it serves as a model to what other utilities in other regions could be doing that could accelerate the pace of deployment. Just another example, the Midwest Independent System Operator stopped the processing of interconnection requests so that they could implement new software at the Midwest System Operator that processes interconnections much, much faster. And they just put out a press release that FERC noted, this week, where they've taken a process that in the past took more than 600 days to do, so 2 years, and they just did it in 10 days, replicated that in 10 days with this software, right? So if we saw those types of things happen, we think we could deploy 25% more solar and storage than what we're deploying right now, right? That's an extra 100 gigawatts of capacity. That's another 80 million homes that could be supplied with power. So that's kind of more optimistic outlook for the pace of deployment that we could see with solar. On the other hand, if we saw the early phase out of the production tax credit and the investment tax credit, if we saw bonus adders eliminated, if we saw delayed fossil retirements, or if these types of reforms that I'm talking about don't happen, we're going to see a slowdown in the amount of solar deployments that happen at a time when we need every energy resource we can possibly get, to be able to meet the demand growth. But in that kind of world, there's still a lot of strong state public policy support in certain parts of the country. There are still corporate buyers that still really want renewable energy as part of their portfolio. So we will continue to see solar and storage deployed. It will just be at a smaller scale. And, we roughly estimate about 25% less capacity getting added over the course of the next decade.
Well, we could speak to costs at all. One of the things that we are watching very closely is, obviously we feel like we're positioned in a pretty good place in terms of maintaining maintaining these tax credits that are going to help the industry actually maintain momentum. But one of the headlines, one of the clear data points, and we've been hearing this across the board, is that if American clean energy incentives were repealed, costs would go up the very next day, right? And you've talked a little bit about infrastructure, transmission infrastructure and things of that nature. But is there anything you can tell us? We believe it, but is there anything you can tell us about why that would be the case?
Yeah, I mean, the production tax credit, the investment tax credit, overall reduces the cost of renewables. I don't have an exact figure, but like roughly by about 20%. And I think there's two really important things to consider. The first one is, affordability of everything is one of the biggest political issues in the United States right now. That includes affordability of energy. And if costs of solar goes up, the only way solar plants get built is if people pay more for energy in its simplest term. I think the other thing that I'm not sure is fully appreciated is that this is an industry that requires like multi-year planning cycles. So just as an example, if you are an electric utility, there's a lengthy regulatory process you have to go through to get approval of what you're going to build. You spend a year preparing a plan. You spend a year going through Public Utility Commission hearings. If the Inflation Reduction Act is modified, all of a sudden, all of the assumptions that went into that multi-year planning process are no longer valid. And so every electric utility is going to have to go back, spend a year redoing a plan, spending a year going through a Public Utility Commission hearing to actually figure out what they can commit to building. So it's very disruptive to a process that takes multi-years to be able to develop what infrastructure you're developing. So those types of modifications, it's not just that it's going to be more expensive, it's also just going to slow down the rate at which we can get things deployed.
That is, I think, a strong message for business certainty. I think that's something that we try and drive home a lot too, that these sorts of monkeying around with policies on, every other year or every year really tends to slow things down. So I wonder if we could maybe wrap up by just asking you to, distill the nature of where we are with the grid and with electricity demand for sort of, a layman's terms, right? If you helped us out a few weeks ago in sort of sharing this message with folks on the Hill and the people in Congress who are currently sort of debating different aspects of budget negotiations that might impact the energy system, and just sort of sharing some of that foundational information about how all of these pieces fit together and how the policies that they're considering sort of could impact the future of the electricity system. So at a super basic level, like what is it about the grid today and perhaps the grid of the future that is not as well understood as it should be, and that you want to make sure that people really understand?
Going back to what I just said, right? Like developing new infrastructure to connect to the electricity grid requires 5 to 10 year planning cycles. And we have demand growth coming from 3 different sources, different scales. The biggest scale one is demand growth coming from data centers that are needed to, power artificial intelligence. The second is the manufacturing renaissance we were just talking about for the solar industry. It's happening not just in the solar industry, it's happening in the solar industry, the storage industry, the semiconductor industry. All those industries are incredibly energy intensive. And if the Trump administration wants to bring back reshoring of even more industries, that's going to require even more electricity. And And then we have electrification of transport and heating, but those first two are the biggest. And to give you a sense of the scale, even electricity demands for the past 15 years has been growing at 0% per year in the United States. There's a lot of uncertainty around what the demand growth rate is going to be. But even if it's just 2% per year, which for most industries doesn't sound like a big number, right? But demand growth of 2% per year would require putting 80 gigawatts of solar energy into the grid every year just to meet demand growth. That doesn't help deal with like retiring coal-fired power plants that we have, right? And 80 gigawatts, that's more than we installed last year just to be able to meet demand growth. And there's got to be a lot of, if we were to meet this with solar alone, there's got to be a lot of storage that would come along with it. And the challenge that we have is that it takes 10 years to build a nuclear power plant in the United States. Nuclear is not going to solve that problem. We just recently put together an analysis that we were sharing at the InfoCast conference that many of us were at earlier this week, and on the gas turbine industry. And if you want to get a gas turbine today to build a new combined cycle power plant and you haven't already ordered a gas turbine, you're not going to be able to get that. The earliest possible date you'll be able to get that gas turbine capacity online is 2029. So 4 years from now, fall of 2029, right? It probably falls into 2030, 5 years from now. And so, and we've gone through the analysis. There are not a lot of gas turbines slated to be delivered to the United States over the course of the next 4 years. And I already talked about how there haven't been a lot of gas projects in the queue. So even though there's a role for gas-fired generation to play, it's not going to help over the course of the next 4 or 5 years. And this demand, the electricity demand growth that we're talking about, I'm not sure that everybody fully appreciates that we have to build new power plants to meet this demand, because this demand sits the center of economic growth in the United States and achieving national security objectives by having the artificial intelligence here and having the US remain a leader within that business. And so we just don't, it is the renewable projects that have been under development for the past 5 to 10 years that are the ones that can be connected to the grid most quickly right now, because there are just so many constraints on other parts of the supply chain and being able to kind of build out this capacity.
Yeah, well, that is a fantastic, I think, distillation of where things sit and why we need to focus so much on resources like solar and storage that can deploy quickly and meet some of this demand that I think everyone is finally coming around to really understand the impact. So appreciate that analysis there, and we'll be continuing to share that message with lawmakers, certainly, but just with the general public, because I think we're in a different environment as sort of an energy sector than we have ever been before, as you pointed out with where we are with demand. So
just the other thing that's in the back of my head on the policy framing, and you all are much better at communicating and distilling these messages than I am. But the other thing that's just on my mind, and it's maybe just too complicated to talk about, is like not getting left behind the rest of the world in making our system like the energy system of the 20th century as opposed to the energy system of the 21st century. And one of the things that I feel like is not really appreciated, and I didn't appreciate this until I was looking at some data like a couple of months ago, is that solar is 2.7 times more expensive in the United States than it is in China. But even more surprising, it's 50% more expensive in the US than it is in Europe. Mm-hmm. And this is because of like the policy choices that we've made, right? Like we have tariffs. We don't allow Huawei to sell equipment here. Even our transmission policy, right? Like we go about transmission in a very inefficient way. So the transmission cost that like new solar or wind getting built, added to the system has to bear is a lot higher than the costs that they have to pay in Europe. And so if you are from a political context. Like if you are sitting in Europe or you're sitting in China right now, solar's incredibly cost competitive. And unlike the US, you have, very high cost natural gas is all you have available from not necessarily reliable partners. So from a geopolitical standpoint, energy security standpoint, you also want to reduce your dependence on gas. And in a way, like the Inflation Reduction Act is so clever because it's like we have tariffs, which makes it more expensive so we can support a domestic industry. And the Inflation Reduction Act just basically helps to offset the cost of the tariffs. It's almost like not a subsidy, right? Like it kind of offsets the tariffs. But to me, from my perspective, like China and Europe are going to be rushing ahead on solar, and it's and like we're not done on the solar cost decline, right? Like I can cite 4 different areas in next year, where we're going to continue to see efficiency improvements on the solar side, and so it's like we don't want to deprive ourselves of something that could help lower the cost of energy over the long term in America by getting left behind. So, it took me so long to explain all that to you guys, but so I don't know how you distill that. But
Chris, really appreciate you taking some time and walking through all this with us, and obviously the sort of longstanding partnership on SMI and other research efforts. Obviously, it undergirds a lot of the work that we do to push all this forward. So really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Steph. Colin, great talking with you this morning.
Thanks, Chris.